In February 1889, the train tracks had lain buried under snow for 9 weeks. Deerfield, Oregon, began to understand what it meant to be abandoned. The supply train due on December 3rd never arrived, and the one planned for December 17th also disappeared. Not even the emergency supply that the territorial governor had pledged for January showed up. Snow, 9 meters deep, blocked the Cascade passes, and the trains intended to plow the rails remained immobile 160 kilometers to the west, utterly useless. Deerfield's Taxation was 260, and the general store's shelves were bare. Gagne Major, every resident understood that the society they depended on had ground to a halt. Starvation arrived step by step. First flour was exhausted. Then the salt pork vanished. Following that, cornmeal, dried beans, and canned goods also ran out. Fletcher Goddard, who ran the mercantile, had previously sold such items at inflated prices, but now those prices had lost all meaning, as there was nothing remaining to offer. Children became gaunt, the elderly fell silent, and an eerie quiet blanketed the town. This was the silence of individuals conserving energy, uncertain of their next meal. Yet on a slope east of Deerfield, where dawn's light arrived earliest and lingered longest, a woman named Hazel Drummond unlocked the door of her drying shed. She surveyed her stock. Shelves crammed from floor to ceiling contained items that no shop in Deerfield could supply. Kilograms of dehydrated fruit, fabric bags, and sealed wooden crates were arranged by variety and preservation date. Apples had been cut into paper-thin slices and desiccated until they became flexible leather. Pears were halved and coated with honey, their flavor so intense it made one's tongue tingle. Plums had been transformed into firm, dark prunes, each crevice retaining the essence of summer. Both sweet and tart cherries were now gem-like bits. A single handful could sustain a full-grown man through a day of labor. Blackberries and huckleberries, dried upon screens, clattered like small pebbles, each berry a compact source of sustenance, amounting to 232 kilograms in all. 2 years of diligent effort had been mocked at every turn. Hazel shut the drying shed, wrapped her shawl more securely against the chill, and made her way to the barn. There, her sorrel mare named Maple was munching hay, relaxed and satisfied. Having prepared in advance, Hazel rested her forehead against the horse's warm neck. She permitted herself a brief pause to feel the fatigue before the actual labor started. "Well, old girl," she murmured, "I expect they'll be showing up before long." Who was this woman, Hazel Drummond, and how had she gotten ready for a catastrophe that nobody else anticipated? Hazel came to Deerfield in the fall of 1885. She was a widow, having turned 44 that spring. Her spouse, George, perished in a logging mishap on the Willamette River. A Douglas fir fell and struck him in the chest. He survived just long enough to express his love for Hazel and to request that she forgive the tree. She complied with both requests. The act of forgiving the tree was more difficult. George bequeathed her a small amount from the timber company. The foreman handed over an envelope containing $200. His face conveyed a wish that she wouldn't cause any difficulties. But she didn't create problems. Instead, she formulated strategies. Hazel Drummond wasn't the kind to succumb to hopelessness. She was raised by a fruit grower. She hailed from the Willamette Valley, an area of vast orchards yielding apples, pears, and cherries in quantities that were almost unbelievable. Her mother, Constance, was an expert at food preservation, capable of dehydrating, canning, pickling, and smoking the summer harvest. These supplies would get a family through even the harshest and longest winter. Constance had acquired this expertise from her own mother, who in turn had learned it in the Tennessee Hill Country. In that region, food preservation was far more than a pastime. It was a crucial survival skill. Hazel picked up these techniques instinctively, much like acquiring a language by age 12. She could manage a dehydration process that would astonish any commercial enterprise. By age 20, she could assess a piece of fruit and instantly determine its sugar concentration and moisture percentage. Understand the ideal drying duration. She understood precisely when to remove it from heat before it transitioned from perfectly preserved to utterly ruined. Following George's death, she examined a map. She selected Deerfield for a single reason. The surrounding hills were abundant with wild fruit. In the clearings, crab apples and wild plums thrived everywhere. High meadows were carpeted with huckleberries, and blackberry bushes overran every fence line. These grew around deserted farmsteads and ancient orchards established by early settlers, which had been abandoned. For years, their fruit rotted on the ground, yet they continued to yield plentifully each fall. Deerfield was overflowing with fruit. Nobody appreciated it except Hazel, who valued it immensely. Hazel possessed the knowledge and the resource, but how could she transform all that overlooked fruit into sustenance that could preserve lives? And why couldn't anyone else recognize its potential? Hazel purchased 2 hectares. On the east-facing hillside above Deerfield, she spent $30 on land that the seller considered hardly worth the paperwork. It was sloping and stony, unsuitable for agriculture or livestock, but it captured the morning sunlight. The afternoon wind consistently blew across it, and these 2 factors made it ideal for Hazel's plan. She constructed her drying shed before her cabin, a long, narrow structure measuring 7.3 meters by 3 meters. The walls featured slats, allowing air circulation. The roof was built from cedar shingles, which kept rain out while preventing moisture retention inside. Inside, she installed wooden racks at 3 levels, waist-high, shoulder-high, and overhead. Every rack carried frames of cheesecloth, tightly stretched over pine borders, sliding in and out like drawers. This allowed her to load and unload fruit without disturbing the pieces already drying. At one end, a small stone fireplace provided supplemental heat on damp autumn days. Occasionally, the sun alone was insufficient to complete the process. Her mother had passed down the secret: mild warmth and consistent airflow. Excessive heat would cook the fruit rather than dehydrate it. That cooking ruined the nutrients that made preserved fruit valuable as food, and the cabin was a secondary priority. It was basic: a single room, a sleeping loft, a fieldstone fireplace for heat, and a covered porch. There she could spend evenings looking out over the valley. Maple, her horse, had a lean-to stable attached to the cabin's north side, warm and dry. The combined expense for the land, drying shed, and cabin amounted to $74. That initial fall in 1885, Hazel began her harvest and labored from daybreak until nightfall. Wild plums were sourced from the creek bottoms, and Maple, her mare, transported them uphill via a wooden sled. Hazel gathered huckleberries in the elevated meadows, leaving her hands stained purple for weeks. She collected dropped apples from abandoned old orchards and categorized them by ripeness. She removed any bruised or wormy portions, then sliced the sound flesh into uniform rings. She placed them on her drying trays with the meticulous hand of a jeweler arranging gems. The drying process itself was a craft inherited through 3 generations. Every fruit required its own unique handling. Apples were cored, peeled, then cut into slices 0.6 centimeters thick, and she briefly immersed them in salted water to prevent discoloration. Pears were cut in half, their cores removed, and Hazel applied a light honey coating. This enhanced their sweetness and imparted a golden sheen to the dried fruit. The plums were cut in half, pits removed, and arranged with the cut side facing upward to allow gradual moisture loss. The cherries were kept whole, with their stems taken off, and dried at the lowest heat setting. This helped maintain both their form and taste. Around the end of October, the initial batch was done. Hazel brought in 1 8-kilogram sample of dried apple rings to Goddard's Mercantile in Deerfield, hoping to make a sale. Fletcher Goddard, a heavy-set man with a reddish beard and sharp, calculating eyes, served as the commercial hub of Deerfield. He was the sole merchant in town. All necessities: flour, sugar, coffee, utensils, cloth, and medicine passed through his establishment. He determined prices, provided credit, and influenced who would prosper and who would face hardship. A woman selling dehydrated fruit from a small hillside shed. At best, she was inconsequential. At worst, a nuisance. He took one of Hazel's apple rings, held it up to the light, took a sniff, and bent it between his thick digits. Obvious contempt was written across his face. "Dried fruit," he remarked in a monotone. "You expect me to market dried fruit?" Hazel did not back down. "What I want is to sell it myself," she clarified. "I'd like to set up a stall outside your shop on market days." Goddard's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Drummond," he began, his tone hardening, "I provide everything this community requires, which includes dried fruit when the supply wagon brings it from Portland. Proper dried fruit from established companies in appropriate packaging. What you have here, he gestured dismissively. Homemade stuff, people stick with what they recognize. They prefer labels and brand names, not something whipped up in a shed by a widow with idle hands. It isn't whipped up, Hazel said softly. It's dried. There's a significant distinction. Goddard leaned in. The answer is no, Mrs. Drummond. You cannot set up outside my store. That would create an unfavorable impression. That unfavorable impression was a sentiment shared by many prominent residents of Deerfield, including Sawyer Boggs, who owned the lumber mill and employed the majority of the town's male workforce. At the saloon, he described the widow's fruit endeavor as a pathetic little undertaking. Born of a pathetic little existence, his wife Lucretia called a meeting of the women's auxiliary at the church. They discussed Hazel, and Mrs. Boggs concluded that her activities were odd and possibly improper. No decent woman, she asserted, would purchase fruit dried in an open-air structure where birds and bugs could wander freely. I'm sure she has good intentions, Mrs. Boggs told her group, but the poor woman has clearly been impacted by the loss of her husband. Dehydrating fruit by the hundreds of kilograms borders on obsession. Before long, the shed was labeled the widow's madhouse. The town made fun of her, but Hazel continued her labor. What motivated her relentless hoarding of a substance that no one else considered valuable? And just how far would her insanity take her? Hazel listened to the jeers. She kept working. Mockery, she understood, was a compliment paid by the idle to the industrious, and she was far too occupied to claim it. Throughout 1886 and 1887, she expanded her business. On her steep slope, she planted 4 apple trees and 3 pear trees, tiny saplings that would require years to yield fruit, but they represented an investment in what lay ahead. Along her fence line, she grew blackberry canes. She trained them on trellises, exposing them to full sunlight. This also made harvesting more convenient. In addition, she formed a connection with 2 households located further up the valley. She exchanged her dried fruit for permission to use their wild huckleberry patches. Her techniques became increasingly accurate and systematic. She tried various drying durations, temperature settings, and pre-treatments for every type of fruit. She discovered that drying plums at a somewhat lower temperature over a longer period produced prunes with superior texture and taste. She discovered that cherries dried above her stone fireplace during rainy weather, with the door slightly open to allow airflow, retained more of their vibrant color compared to those dried in direct sunlight. She also devised a method for compressing dried berries. These could be formed into compact blocks, wrapped in wax fabric, and kept for an extended period. She additionally learned how to make trail food that was extremely lightweight yet incredibly nutrient-dense. She mastered proper storage methods. The drying shed was used for processing. For permanent preservation, she constructed a distinct building, a chilly, dim chamber excavated into the slope directly behind her cabin. She lined the room with cedar boards to repel insects and dampness, and placed the dried fruit into fabric bags. Subsequently, the fruit was transferred into airtight wooden crates. Every crate was meticulously marked with its contents and preparation date, and she maintained a register. That register tracked each kilogram that was processed, consumed, and still in stock. By fall 1888, her records indicated a stockpile of 230 kilograms. That was a remarkable quantity, sufficient to feed a woman and a horse for over 5 years, far beyond what any sensible individual would require. The residents of Deerfield, who had ridiculed her for 3 years, interpreted this overabundance as definitive evidence of her insanity. 230 kilograms of dried fruit, Goddard informed shoppers in his shop while shaking his head. That woman is completely out of her senses. Why would anyone require 230 kilograms of fruit? She'll be buried under prunes long before she's laid to rest in the soil. Sawyer Boggs chuckled until tears streamed down his face. Maybe she intends to start a business, he gasped. Drummond's dried goods, selling insanity by the kilo. Hazel listened to every remark. She then increased her stock by another 9 kilograms of preserved pears. She remained silent. This was not merely an accumulating stash. It was a deliberate bet against a future that nobody else foresaw. Subscribe. The verification appears in the coming moments, and it's nothing like what was anticipated. The fall of 1888 delivered a relentless downpour. It drenched the mountain passes. The train tracks became soft and hazardous, while the unpaved routes into Deerfield turned into muddy streams. On November 15, the final supply locomotive arrived in town. At that moment, nobody realized its significance. The railway company had not reported any issues. The timetables at the station indicated trains arriving every 2 weeks throughout the winter, as usual. However, those timetables were produced in Portland, and they were created by individuals who had never experienced a Cascade winter. That winter between 1888 and 1889 would expose them all as deceivers. The first train that failed to arrive caused little concern, as winter delays were typical. The second missed train made people anxious. And then the third one came. That train had been scheduled to arrive on December 31. It was transporting both regular provisions and festive holiday goods. Households had placed orders weeks in advance, and when it failed to appear, anxiety escalated into concern. By mid-January, that concern had transformed into fear. Goddard's Mercantile, the local general store, had entered winter with reasonable supplies, but now its inventory was dwindling. Flour was the first to run out. It always was, because flour was the foundation of every frontier kitchen. In its absence, bread, biscuits, gravy, and many other essential items were impossible to make. Sugar vanished next, followed by coffee, a drink that loggers and mill workers depended on as heavily as a preacher relied on the Bible. After that came salt pork, canned goods, and dried beans. The shelves that were once fully stocked now remained empty. They seemed to reproach, much like a guilty conscience. Goddard portioned out the small remaining supplies and increased his prices sharply rather than gradually, as if seizing a weapon in a moment of fear. The cost of a sack of flour jumped from $2 to $5, then to $8, and finally to $12. Once confident families came to understand that their security was fleeting and fragile. It hinged entirely on a broken supply chain, which gave way like a frayed cord. Starvation began to take hold in February. This was not the abrupt famine of a besieged town. Instead, it was a gradual, relentless shortage. The community was gradually depleting its resources. Daily meals dwindled from 3 to 2, and then to just 1. Mothers gave food to their children while going hungry themselves. Older people, as is common, endured their hardship quietly. They avoided adding to their families' worries about their own requirements. During that month, 2 individuals died. Elderly Garfield S.S., a former logger, was discovered lifeless in his cabin. He had an empty food pantry, but a fully stocked woodpile. He remained warm, yet he died of starvation. The Navarro family's baby daughter had been weakening since January. She passed away on a Tuesday evening. Her mother sang her a Spanish lullaby about a place where fruit trees bore fruit endlessly. On Wednesday morning, Hazel Drummond learned of these deaths from one of the Hill families, who still came to see her. She paused in her drying shed, surrounded by the plenty that 3 years of labor had produced. Without any delay, she made her choice. Hazel packed 45 kilograms of dried fruit apples, pears, plums, cherries, and berry cakes onto her sorrel mare, Maple. She rode down the icy hill to Deerfield and halted in front of Goddard's vacant store, the very place where he had turned her away 3 years earlier. Using planks and sawhorses, she assembled a temporary table and then stood waiting. The first to arrive was a young boy, roughly 10 years old. Beneath a wool cap that was too large for his head, his face looked gaunt. He gazed at the dried fruit with his eyes wide open. Caught between hunger and skepticism, he acted as if he had discovered something too good to be true. In a gentle voice, Hazel told him, "Go ahead, take as much as you need. It's free." The boy shifted his gaze from her to the fruit and back again. He grabbed 2 handfuls of dried apple rings and dashed off. Word spread within an hour. The widow residing on the hill possessed food. The eccentric woman with her shed overflowing with dried fruit was the talk of the town. The person they had mocked, the eccentric, solitary woman with 227 kilograms of prunes. She possessed what Goddard's store lacked, what the train couldn't bring, and what currency couldn't purchase. A constant flow of people arrived. Mothers toted their children on their hips. Loggers moved with the subdued disgrace of starving men written across their expressions. The elderly shuffled through the freezing weather, leaning on younger relatives, pulled toward a table heaped with sugary offerings. Their expressions, previously sunken with fear, now showed a spark of urgent optimism. Hazel distributed her supplies with composed, habitual motions. She portioned out quantities according to household size, ensuring that each family had enough for a full week. She also demonstrated how to rehydrate the dried fruit in warm water and simmer it into a dense, sweet compote that could be extended further. And to provide longer-lasting satisfaction compared to eating it dry, she lifted one of her berry cakes, explaining that each cake was roughly the size of a man's palm. It contained enough energy for a full day of strenuous labor. It was essentially trail food, dense nutrition. Every day for 5 weeks, Hazel Drummond returned with another 45 kilograms, repeatedly feeding Deerfield. Each morning she woke before sunrise, packed her sledge, guided Maple down the icy slope, and handed out her produce to anyone who showed up. She also included additional items, dried deer meat from the families on the hill and potatoes from her root cellar. To that, she added eggs from her 3 hens, which had continued laying throughout the winter in their heated coop next to her cabin. The dried fruit proved far more nourishing than anyone had anticipated. It was dense with sugar and fiber, the very essence of summer condensed. Children who consumed it regained their healthy complexion within days, and adults who had become feeble and lethargic gradually felt their energy come back. The berry cakes in particular were a marvel. They were easy to carry, had a long shelf life, and were incredibly nutritious. They kept the mill workers going when no other food could. Hazel saved the town. Yet those in power who ridiculed her continue to observe. How will they react to their own disgrace and the collapse of their authority? Throughout those 5 weeks, Fletcher Goddard observed from his barren store. His expression changed. Initially, there was resentment, then confusion, and finally an emotion near to shame. His shelves were empty, his prices became irrelevant. A widow equipped with a drying shed had shattered his monopoly over the town's food supply. Her achievement came from 3 years of patient effort. Sawyer Boggs also observed his mill had closed in January due to a lack of supplies, no market, and no cause to operate. His own employees were now queuing at Hazel's distribution. His wife Lucretia, who had previously labeled Hazel's efforts as unhealthy and odd, was spotted one morning taking a bag of dried pears. She kept her gaze lowered. At long last, the supply train arrived. The date was the 9th of March, 1880, 96 days since the previous shipment. The engine emerged through the mountain pass, steam streaming behind it like a victorious flag. Its cars were loaded with flour and coffee, every commodity Deerfield had lacked for months. The townspeople cheered with a relief that bordered on desperation. Yet the celebration had a dark side. An accounting was approaching and it could not be delayed. A meeting was scheduled for the following Sunday, held at the church, the largest structure in town. It seemed the appropriate venue for a grave matter. Everyone who had made it through attended. Fletcher Goddard requested to be the first speaker. He made his way to the front with a heavy gait, reminiscent of someone who had been preparing a confession for weeks. His voice was devoid of its typical bravado. 3 years ago, he began, a woman entered my establishment. She carried a sample of dried fruit. She requested permission to sell it from a table just outside my entrance. He halted, his red beard quivered, and he continued. I turned her down. I informed her that people desired legitimate products from legitimate businesses. I said that homemade fruit from a shed on the hillside did not meet the standards of my store. He glanced around. My store has stood vacant for 3 months. My shelves have contained nothing except dust and dishonor. He went on, his voice breaking. And the woman I rejected, the one this town labeled insane, odd, the widow from the madhouse. That very woman nourished your families when I was powerless. She fed my own family, despite my having given her every justification to leave us starving. He pivoted to look at Hazel. She was seated in her customary spot toward the rear. He swallowed hard and admitted, Mrs. Drummond, I was mistaken regarding your fruit, your techniques, and you as a person. I was a merchant with nothing to offer, while you were a woman with so much to provide. I don't merit your pardon, yet I still request it. Then Sawyer Boggs stood up. As the mill owner, he had previously laughed so hard his eyes teared up. Now, confronted with the notion of 225 kilograms of dried fruit, he struggled to look at those observing him. He spoke softly. My wife informed her group that Mrs. Drummond's business was unhealthy. Yet last month, she consumed Mrs. Drummond's pears and cried they reminded her of summer, a flavor she had nearly forgotten. Gradually, he shook his head. I labeled her endeavor a pathetic small venture from a pathetic small existence, but I was actually portraying my own nature, not hers. Then others came forward, mothers who had nourished their kids and lumberjacks who had regained their vitality. The older citizens remained alive only because a woman they had never conversed with still considered them. The community admitted its foolishness. But what insight would Hazel provide in response, and how would that transform the future of Deerfield? After every admission concluded, Hazel Drummond rose. Though not tall, her posture upright, with clear eyes and a calm demeanor, seemed to fill the entire church. My mother taught me how to preserve fruit, she stated plainly, and her mother instructed her. She clarified that her storage shed wasn't stocked due to her intelligence or foresight. It was stocked from routine. That routine belonged to women who understood that summer is temporary and that trains are not always reliable. Those women knew that the sole nourishment one can rely on is the one you make on your own. She glanced across the room. I didn't preserve 225 kilos of fruit to make a statement, she informed them. I did it because I cannot stand waste. Each autumn, fruit dropped from trees throughout Deerfield and spoiled on the soil, good edibles abandoned to insects and the elements. In the meantime, the entire community relied on a timetable from Portland, created by individuals who had never experienced a single winter in this area. Her tone then grew gentler. She paused. I hold no anger toward any of you. Ridicule is simply what people engage in when they lack comprehension. Now you comprehend. She scanned every person's expression. Should you wish to acquire this skill, I am prepared to instruct you. She stated plainly, the fruit is available to gather. The sunlight costs nothing. The method is straightforward. She insisted that no household in that valley would ever have to suffer from hunger again, provided they were ready to put in the effort during summer. 11 additional drying structures emerged on the slopes surrounding Deerfield. Every single one was constructed under Hazel's careful supervision. She instructed the women, and also a few men, in the same craft that her mother and grandmother had mastered. She demonstrated the proper time to harvest fruit and how to prepare it for dehydration. She guided them in controlling temperature and ventilation, as well as preserving the final product for extended periods if required. The merchant, Fletcher Goddard, introduced a section in his shop specifically for dried fruit. That section exclusively featured locally sourced items. He displayed them with a handwritten sign reading Deerfield's Greatest, made by our own. He set just prices and compensated his providers equally justly. One afternoon, he confessed to Hazel, "This is the most upright enterprise I have ever operated." Eventually, Lucretia Boggs, who had previously labeled Hazel's efforts as unwholesome, transformed into one of Hazel's finest apprentices. Lucretia produced dried pears that Hazel herself considered equal in quality to hers. These two women, who had never exchanged a pleasant comment prior to the scarcity, grew to be intimate companions. On Hazel's porch during autumn afternoons, they sliced fruit and observed the valley turning golden with autumn foliage. The saying that filled the shed turned into everyday wisdom in Deerfield. It signified preparing for difficult periods while times were good. It meant storing the abundance of today for future shortages. The townspeople spoke it with a profound, quiet conviction, as if they had grasped its meaning from an experience that allowed no uncertainty. Deerfield took the lesson to heart, and Hazel's influence expanded. What lasting impact did she have on Deerfield, and what lessons does her narrative offer us now? The railroad tracks had lain buried for 9 weeks. The town of Deerfield, Oregon, had understood the experience of being neglected, yet Hazel Drummond demonstrated an alternative path. During periods of abundance, getting ready often appears as irrational fear. During emergencies, it seems like foresight. Hazel Drummond continued residing on her hillside for an additional 27 years. Each autumn she preserved fruit by drying it until her hands became too frail to grasp a knife. She died in the spring of 1916 at the age of 75. Her burial site was next to George in the graveyard. Overlooking the valley, Maple, her trusted mare, had died a decade earlier and was laid to rest near the drying shed. That very shed where the mare had spent countless patient mornings observing Hazel loading her sledge. The drying shed remains standing to this day. Its cedar shingles have been swapped out on 3 occasions. The interior racks have undergone 2 reconstructions. Yet the building itself remains Hazel's original. The families caring for it still adhere precisely to her techniques. Each autumn, when the fruit reaches ripeness, women assemble at that location. They carry on the labor that a widow initiated with only sorrow, wisdom, and an unyielding conviction that the bounty of summer must never be squandered. Carved into the wood above the doorway in 1890, the year following the famine, there is an inscription. It was etched by a hand that understood fruit better than woodworking. Summer may forget, but the shed retains its memory. Constance, Hazel's mother, who brought that wisdom from the Tennessee hills, would have identified each principle. If you would like more narratives about overlooked knowledge and gentle perseverance, consider subscribing. There are always additional teachings concealed in history, and I ask you, what ancient method do you believe we have overlooked that still holds an application no one has discovered yet?